Before we get to that bright future of smart cities adept at being responsive to the needs of their citizens, we must first have the technological infrastructure in place. My next two guests are experts on this subject. Shirley Bloomfield is the CEO of the Rural Broadband Association. We've been discussing the rural broadband connectivity issue a lot today. This represents nearly 850 independent telecommunications companies in small-town America. And Jonathan Adelstein is the president and CEO of the Wireless Infrastructure Association, which is comprised of 200 firms building wireless broadband facilities across the United States. He was also a former commissioner at the FCC, and of course, we started with the chairman of the FCC at today's forum. Welcome to you both. Great to have you here. So I sort of feel like, why can't we just leave it to both of you to solve all this? You know, wire the country, figure out the rural area. We had Larry Irving up and saying, hey, don't forget the parts of cities that aren't connected. And so let me just start, with you, Shirley, and ask, what are the deficits in our infrastructure that we have to get right to make the promise of 5G and single millimeter wave and all of this, inclusive and to really make it work for the nation?
So, Steve, that's a loaded question. And I would say a multi-million-dollar question.
Just millions?
And let me
just millions we can handle.
Billions, trillions. So you forget how big this country is, and that becomes a big part. Part of it is a geography question, and not only that, with the diverse geography we have. So when you look at the United States, and the challenge there is to provide connectivity, it's a lot of landmass. And even as you were kind of delving in, and I don't want to jump around too much, but you were delving into millimeter wave and 5G. All of that requires a wired infrastructure. So you've got to start thinking about, what is it going to take to actually get that infrastructure out to these areas? And I think that we've got a lot of work to do. We've got some great programs that are in place, but, historically, you've got to look at it that you've got, in a lot of ways, people like to talk about the rural-urban divide. I really see it more as a rural-rural divide. You've got community-based entities that are out there and innovators that are out there providing technology and connectivity to their communities. And then you've got some very large incumbent carriers, who historically had those territories, but are now so focused on their competitive markets that we need to find solutions for the people who live in some of those market territories. So it's a big task ahead. But even as you were talking about building smart cities, we've got to think about what does it take to build smart rural communities, and how do you get everybody to the table on that?
Jonathan, how do you see the picture? I mean, Shirley just put on the fan that we've got lots of wiring still to do. And, there's a lot I don't understand about the wireless world and how much it depends on being wired. But do you have a way for your members to strategically leapfrog over the infrastructure deficits we have?
I think we do. We're making unprecedented investments in infrastructure, $30 billion a year, more than any other industry in the country. This is really private sector driven. This is not something that we need a lot for, except we need to make sure that we have the ability to properly site the equipment, which we've gotten support for, not only from the federal government, but nearly 30 states have passed laws to enable broadband deployment to be streamlined. The Federal Communications Commission just last month issued a ruling that cleared the way for siting equipment on existing structures, so that we wouldn't have to reinvent the wheel when we're trying to upgrade to 5G on existing structures. So the FCC is getting it right. Of course, we need more spectrum. They're trying to identify as much as they can. They have put out a 5G fund, $9 billion they propose, and I think they need to move fast on that. But we're not relying on support outside of the industry. It's something that we can do ourselves if we just get governments basically to work with us in a cooperative way, which we have. I mean, municipalities are largely supportive of this. They recognize they need 5G in their communities. So we're, getting the process streamlined sufficiently. We're getting on a federal and state level support for doing that. And we'll make the investments to make it happen. Already you're seeing 5G begin to spread across the country, including a lot of rural areas of the country. And we expect after a short period of massive investment and building, we'll get it done. One thing I am worried about is making sure we have the workforce to get it done. But short of that, we're moving ahead.
I mean, do we have the workforce?
We really don't. We have not the skills in place. I mean, right now we have this pandemic, which has slowed us down a little bit, but not much. but it's also opened up the workforce. I mean, we were really tight on labor, but now we have all these people that are looking for work, but we have to have mechanism to reskill them. So Congress, for example, is talking about investing $80 billion that was approved by the House for broadband deployment, putting it on steroids. We're already trying to build up 5G so the workforce is tight as it is. If we want to make this happen, we need to put the workforce on steroids as well. We need to make sure that we invest in training programs. I mean, a tiny portion of that 80 billion will go a long way if it was invested by Congress in training and apprenticeships and helping employers, giving employers incentives to make sure their workforce is ready for this. I mean, there's a lot of competing demands, but I think we all understand that if we get 5G built and win the race to 5G and beat the Chinese, we're going to create jobs not only in our sector, in the telecommunications sector, but in virtually every other sector of the economy.
Let me just ask you, let me get you both in a little bit of trouble here, and ask you this question that it used to be when you said the words industrial policy, like in the Obama administration or the Bush administration, you were, shuttled outside the door. You were never allowed to articulate those words. Now everyone's celebrating it. But, I sort of feel like now we talk about industrial policy, but I'm not sure we have one. And in this area, when we're talking about 5G and we're talking about what we need, we talk about training workers, we talk about, building technology and basically blocking some foreign companies from telecom infrastructure. That by nature is industrial policy, but are we getting it right? I mean, one of the questions is, what does the United States need to do, Shirley and Jonathan, to get that bet right? Because you are picking winners and losers in that case, are you not, Shirley?
Absolutely. You're picking winners and losers, and you really got to kind of think beyond kind of the current mindset. So I would step back just a little bit and say, there's a couple of different questions I think you're asking, to be honest with you. But one of the things that I think we need to do, when you're talking about, who's going to win, who's the first, who's the fastest, I think you've got to look at what makes sense. I agree with Jonathan on a number of things, certainly in terms of, how we develop our workforce and how we train people, how we make sure that we're actually using the right technology that keeps America and national security in place. But I also think we've got to even take really elementary steps. So whether you call it industrial policy or whether you just kind of call it smart public policy, for example, when I think about connectivity, we've got to do a better job of mapping, and you can't just throw it to Congress or to the FCC. Everybody's trying to take some good steps here, but it's kind of like trying to solve a problem when we don't even know quite what the problem actually is. And that is where I think we need to go back to some basics when we think about whether it is putting in infrastructure, fiber networks. And I will say, this is where I love you, Jonathan, but I disagree. You absolutely need fiber to actually make wireless work, regardless of where you are. But those are some of the steps that I would take back, again, but Jonathan may have some additional thoughts there.
Jonathan, were those fighting words?
No, actually, surely I don't think we disagree. I think we do agree. You need fiber connected to every antenna. Right now, the biggest business in the wireline is connecting that fiber to the antennas. So yeah, we do agree, but ultimately the antenna will give you the reach you need in rural areas. Stepping back to the industrial policy question, the Chinese are engaging in industrial policy. Right now, they've selected 5G as the winner. And I think, communist allocation of capital is not nearly as efficient as ours. In the United States, we're doing it through private investment. But what the Chinese are getting right is, yes, 5G is, if you're going to do industrial policy, if you're going to do a state-run type economy, a great idea. In the United States, all we're asking is help us get there. Don't throw up impediments. We're willing to work reasonably with governments. And I think we've set reasonable guidelines. We'll work within the rights of way. We'll set height limits, but let us build these networks. And secondly, education is something that has always been the province of government. And we need support for reskilling workers to come into our industry. You can bet that the Chinese aren't saying, oh, geez, we don't have enough technicians to do this work. They say X number of people are going into the schools, they're going to get in there, they're going to take these courses, and they're going to build this. And then they remove every impediment to getting it done. All we're saying is we want to do that on our own, but let's have a little bit of support. It's hard to make the American system move on a dime like that, but let's at least make sure that we're getting support to where it needs to be in community colleges, doing telecommunications courses. And yes, I think, fiber, let's teach them fiber splicing, because you'd have to do that to get to the antenna. But ultimately, the complicated issue is when that antenna is in a really complex environment at the end of the line, where there's a lot more antennas closer to end users in 5G, it requires technical skills to advance at the same time. And we better make sure that we have people ready to do that.
You know, one of the, I think, big challenges, and right at the core of the reason we did this conference, is we've seen lots of conversations about gadgets being connected, about the Internet of Things, 5G, data, all of this coming together. And it almost sounded like there's a, techno-determinism that's beyond people and humans that it's supposed to be about. So I said, well, why don't we talk about what humans want? Put them back in the driver's seat. But there is this tension, I think, between what's happening technologically and what's possible, and whether people become enhanced and empowered by it, or whether they become victims of it. And so I know you both represent industry, but I guess my question is, not what's the answer, but how do you get it right so that humans aren't left behind, so that they are built in to this and not just run over? Shirley?
That is such an intriguing question, because you're kind of saying, how do we use technology for the good? And honestly, if there have been any lessons that we have learned from this pandemic, it should be how technology has really helped us stay connected, helped our kids continue to learn, helped our people to use telehealth instead of going into what might be a dangerous situation. So I think it's finding that balance. Where is it that, when you're talking about precision ag, the ability to increase the ROI and the efficiency for an American farmer without tipping to the point of, well, you know what, I don't need anybody to actually, man the farm. I think that there are so many interesting applications we are just on the verge of. But the things that I find the most intriguing are the ones that actually have that human element, where the technology aids our ability as humans to do something better, to do it smarter, to do it faster, but also with an edge of collaboration. So I'd like to think that we've learned a lot about that during the past 4 months, and those are lessons that we can take forward. But I think that this has accelerated some of those artificial intelligence, connected devices, has really kind of gone into overdrive, given the fact that we are all doing all kinds of connected things from wherever we may be these days.
Jonathan, your thoughts?
Well, yeah, obviously there's good and bad that comes with the internet. I thought it was going to be all good when we first started, when I was on the FCC, in an earlier era. But I think Shirley's dead on that we are looking at this pandemic. We couldn't do our jobs without broadband today. And I think about the healthcare applications and the life-saving service that telecommunications can provide, where people can't go to their doctors, so they're calling in on FaceTime to determine whether they need to go into the hospital because they can't breathe. There's a lot of great changes that are going to happen. And our industry delivers the capability. We deliver the bandwidth. And then ultimately, I'm not a policymaker anymore, so it's not our determination to decide what to do with it. But we see what we call economics externalities. We see that our industry invests $30 billion a year, but we don't necessarily recover the value of that. You look at the Facebooks and the Googles and the Amazons that are making incredible profits relative to the carriers or those that are delivering broadband technology, and the profits are accruing to every industry in the country, to jobs, to economic development, to healthcare, to education, to keeping people connected. And yes, there's some things that go with that we don't all necessarily like, but there's also some wonderful things that happen. And if we didn't do it here in the United States, if we let the Chinese, for example, win the race to 5G, the next Uber might be founded there. The next whatever it might be, the next application we haven't even thought of yet will happen in another country, and those jobs won't happen here, and people won't be able to put the food on the table for their families or generate that economic growth in rural areas, which would otherwise be there if they were connected. So I think from a policymaker perspective, the 5G investments are more than justified by the fact that every sector of the economy is going to benefit, even if there are some downsides that ultimately policymakers can't control when those broadband pipes are wide open.
Well, this has been a fascinating conversation. And Jonathan, we didn't get to the part about you being a great harmonica player and playing with Rock Hall of Famers, and I see the musical keyboards above you, but that'll be a whole nother show. But I want to thank Shirley Bloomfield, CEO of NTCA, the Rural Broadband Association, and Jonathan Adelstein, President and CEO of the Wireless Industry Association. Thank you so much for your insights into this, and I hope you'll come back someday because we'll keep at this. So thank you.
Perfect. Take care.
So my colleague Bob Cusack has been listening to me here for a minute. And I just want to say, Bob, maybe one of the mistakes we make in this forum or these kinds of forums is we're bringing on really competent people who seem to have their act together. They've got a plan, they've got strategy, they know what money they have going on. And, government lately doesn't seem to be operating with those kinds of plans. So, maybe we ought to have a thing of, people that just aren't as organized, or, sloppier. But, I know this is silly to say, because government and all of these things aren't so neatly achieved. And there are a lot of accidents and failures to act. And I guess my question is, when you're an expert in politics, politics is messy. And so what do you think the blind spots of today's conversation are on the messy side?
Well, I thought your interview just now was very interesting, and Jonathan was mentioning China, and that they are not going to be sitting back and saying, well, we've got a workforce issue, what are we going to do about it? That basically they're better at dealing with their workforce issues than we are. And it was interesting in the conversation, too, that you need, obviously, you're talking about private industry, but being helped by the federal and state governments. But when you think about the workforce and going forward is, listen, I mean, we've got an aging population, so if there are workforce issues now, then there's going to be problems down the road. And the other thing that your conversation made me think of is as bad as COVID-19 has been to the health and to our economic well-being and millions of people losing jobs, think about if COVID-19 had hit before the internet. That would even be more devastating because so many more people wouldn't be able to do their jobs from home. So that, I think, kind of with some of the thoughts that came out of your conversation with them.
There was a book once called More Human, and this book was written by a conservative. He actually has a Fox News show, and the idea that he was positing is that progress may be the wrong ideal, that maybe we need to think about, what people need in their lives, slow things down, not look at, all of these steps forward. I don't necessarily buy it, but it's a very interesting take that perhaps, and it gets at that question of the nexus between progress and keeping it connected to people, and whether that is, fundamental or not. Let me ask you another question, which is about debt, because nearly every person that we've had on, I think we'll have somebody on later that raises a counterpoint to this. But a lot of people talk about the need for more investment, more infrastructure, more money for schools, safety, investment in science. But our debt levels are skyrocketing. Do they matter to anyone anymore? Because you've sort of seen a lot of the GOP in Congress all of a sudden doesn't seem to care much about debt, and maybe some of the Democrats look like fiscal conservatives in this, but we don't talk about debt. We talk about, what do we need to put in it? But is that a topic that politically has been taken off the table?
I think it's a great question, Stephen. I do think that eventually this debt is going to matter. I mean, you have entitlement programs, specifically Medicare, that are going bankrupt. And as you mentioned, neither party is really talking about it now. And at the beginning of this Congress, Nancy Pelosi adopted a pay-as-you-go rule, which did not go over well with the left of her party. I'm wondering in the next Congress, and in all likelihood Democrats are going to retain the House, if they're going to jettison that rule, because there is this thinking, and some on the left, that the deficits don't matter. But when you look at our programs that have to be funded, Social Security and Medicare, unfortunately Congress, which is broken, they don't deal with stuff like the Balanced Budget Act of 1997, which I covered a lot, especially on the healthcare side. They didn't balance the budget until they had to. Medicare was going bankrupt. It was a couple years away. So I do think eventually it's going to matter, but right now it really doesn't.
Well, Bob, thank you for hanging out with us for a while and sharing your thoughts. I have a lot more questions for you, so don't go away.